There is a strip of land on this planet that has been burned to the ground, invaded by a foreign army, driven to bankruptcy, torn apart by riots, and attacked by terrorists. And in 400 years, it has never once stopped growing, not paused, not slowed, grown. Every single generation has thrown something at this island that should have finished it for good, and every single time, the island absorbed the damage, buried its dead, and kept building anyway. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why nothing has ever managed to kill this city. And once you see the pattern repeat itself over and over, you will never look at it the same way again. Stick around, because the middle of this story is far darker and far stranger than most people ever learn. Before any of this existed, the land itself would be unrecognizable to anyone standing here today. Thick forest ran from shore to shore, broken up by wetlands, low hills, and rivers on either side. The people who called this place home, the Lenape, had lived here for at least 13,000 years. They knew every current that moved through the harbor and every ridge hidden beneath the soil. And the trails they wore into the earth over centuries didn't disappear when everything else changed. One of them still cuts diagonally across the modern street grid today, defying the rigid right angles built around it, now carrying traffic under a completely different name. The very name of the island itself is believed to come from their language, likely meaning something close to Island of Many Hills. In the early 1500s, an Italian explorer sailing for the French crown became the first European to lay eyes on this harbor, describing it in a letter as a strikingly pleasant place between two low hills. Nearly a century later, an English sea captain working for a Dutch trading company sailed into the same waters looking for a shortcut to Asia. He never found his passage. But the descriptions that made it back to Europe about what he'd seen instead, a wild, untouched river valley, set something in motion that the people already living there could never have stopped. What actually pulled Europeans across the Atlantic wasn't gold or land, it was a hat. Fashionable society across Europe had become obsessed with broad-brimmed hats made from felted beaver fur, waterproof, durable, and expensive enough to signal real wealth. The beaver population back home had already been hunted to near extinction, but reports from across the ocean described a river valley crawling with them. Within 2 years, Dutch trading ships were making the crossing regularly, and by the 1620s, a permanent trading post sat at the island's southern tip, a small cluster of wooden buildings, home to a tiny population that wasn't even mostly Dutch. Many of the earliest settlers were French-speaking refugees who had fled religious persecution back home and simply needed somewhere new to build a life. A company official soon purchased the island for a bundle of trade goods worth a small sum, and that single transaction became one of history's great misunderstandings. The only surviving record of it is a single letter, still preserved today. The problem is that the group the Dutch negotiated with almost certainly didn't even live on Manhattan itself. They were based across the water, and the Lenape who actually lived there never agreed to anything. To make it stranger, the Lenape didn't even understand land ownership the way Europeans did. To them, land could be shared, not permanently handed away. Both sides went home convinced they'd gotten the better deal. Only one side turned out to be right, and the other side would spend the next century paying for that misunderstanding. The trading post grew into something chaotic and strange almost immediately, nothing like the orderly Dutch colonies people imagine. Within its first couple of decades, a visiting clergyman counted nearly 18 different languages being spoken inside its walls, in a settlement of only a few hundred people. It had far more taverns than churches, and within the very first year of the settlement's existence, enslaved Africans were already being brought in by force, put to work clearing land, building roads, and raising the fort's walls, the earliest thread of a much darker pattern that would only tighten with time. Meanwhile, the real fortune in furs wasn't even made here. It moved through a trading post far upriver, with this island serving mainly as the loading dock where everything got shipped out toward Europe. Tens of thousands of pelts flowed through in just a handful of years, even as the Lenape were steadily pushed further and further from land they had lived on for 13 millennia. The tension between both understandings of that original land deal eventually detonated into open war. Villages were burned, farms destroyed. Ambushes and raids swept the entire region for 2 brutal years, all authorized by one governor sitting safely inside the fort while the colony around him nearly collapsed completely. Well over 1,000 Lenape and allied people were killed. Hundreds of settlers fled back across the ocean. The entire experiment came close to simply ending right there. It took an entirely different kind of leader to drag the colony back from that brink. A stubborn, short-tempered man who had lost a leg to a cannonball and replaced it with a wooden one wrapped in silver bands. He arrived to a colony still smoldering from war, told the residents he would govern them like a stern father governs his children, and they were, understandably, unimpressed. And yet over the following years he built something remarkable out of the wreckage, a defensive wall along the settlement's northern edge that later gave a certain financial street its name, a properly laid-out main road, paved streets, fire regulations, and the colony's very first organized government. He turned a muddy trading outpost into something resembling an actual town. He was also, by every account, a genuine tyrant. He tried to ban anyone who wasn't part of his own strict religious denomination from worshiping freely, targeting Jewish residents, Quakers, and Lutherans alike. His own residents pushed back hard enough that a group of them wrote a petition defending the right of all people to worship as they pleased, a document historians now consider a direct ancestor of ideas later written into America's founding laws. His response was to arrest the people who signed it. Then, in the summer of 1664, English warships appeared in the harbor and simply asked for the entire colony, offering to let residents keep their property, their laws, and their freedoms if they surrendered peacefully. The governor wanted to fight to the death. His own townspeople didn't. He was overruled. The letter was read aloud to the gathered crowd, and not a single shot was fired. The Dutch packed up and left. The English walked in, and remarkably, almost nothing on the ground actually changed. Same street names, same shopkeepers, same taverns staying open late. Control flipped once more nearly a decade later, before settling permanently under English rule. But one thing did shift immediately and permanently. Under Dutch rule, slavery had existed in a murky, loosely enforced space with occasional paths to freedom. Under English rule, it hardened into strict, permanent, generational law. Within decades, an enormous share of the city's households owned enslaved people, the highest proportion of any city in the entire American North, and an open-air market for buying and selling human beings opened at the foot of that same financial street the earlier governor had built his wall along. In 1712, a group of enslaved New Yorkers rose up in a desperate rebellion, setting a fire and attacking those who came to put it out. The uprising was crushed almost immediately, and the executions that followed were deliberately brutal, designed purely to terrify the enslaved population into submission. Rather than reflect on why the uprising happened, the city responded with even harsher laws. 2 decades later, a printer was put on trial simply for publishing criticism of the colonial governor, and when a jury acquitted him on the grounds that true statements couldn't be considered libel, it planted a seed that would eventually grow into one of America's founding principles, freedom of the press. By the mid-1700s, the town had grown into one of the busiest ports anywhere under the British Crown, its skyline slowly shifting from old stepped Dutch rooftops to elegant new townhouses and rising church spires. And then Britain made a mistake it would come to regret badly, taxing paper goods of every kind, from newspapers to playing cards, without asking anyone's consent. The reaction was immediate and physical. Liberty poles went up in the town square as a symbol of defiance. Soldiers tore them down. Residents built bigger ones in response, over and over, until one was blown apart with explosives and rebuilt wrapped in iron. That escalating standoff eventually exploded into an actual street battle, clubs and blades against bayonets, weeks before a far more famous clash up in Boston, which means the very first blood of the American Revolution wasn't spilled in Massachusetts at all. It was spilled here. By the time full-scale war arrived, the city was split almost evenly between loyalists and patriots, and increasingly, nobody could tell which side their neighbor was really on. An American general arrived with thousands of troops and orders to hold the harbor at any cost, only to watch an invasion fleet of unprecedented size sail in and crush his army completely in the largest single battle of the entire war. Trapped with a river at his back and enemy forces closing in on three sides, he pulled off one of the most audacious retreats in military history, quietly ferrying his entire surviving army across dark water overnight, the very last boat slipping away hidden by a conveniently timed fog. The city fell anyway within weeks. Fire tore through a quarter of it soon after. A foreign army then occupied the city for 7 grinding years, the longest occupation any American city endured during the entire war, while anchored prison ships nearby killed more captured soldiers through disease, starvation, and neglect than died in every battle of the Revolution combined. When peace finally came and the last occupying troops prepared to leave, they greased a flagpole as a final petty insult so no one could raise a new flag. And a lone soldier climbed it anyway, nailing in makeshift footholds by hand, just to replace the enemy's colors with new ones. A small, stubborn act that somehow captures this entire city's personality in a single image. A few years later, the nation's first president took his oath of office from a balcony in Lower Manhattan, and for one brief moment, this became the capital of an entire country. Then the government packed up and moved to Philadelphia, leaving the city half-burned, without its old economic engine, and effectively starting over from nothing. So how did it manage to become one of the most important ports on the entire planet within a single generation? 2 things did it. First, a young surveyor was sent out to map every hill, swamp, and stream across the island in painstaking detail, and city planners then drew a rigid, perfectly straight grid directly over all of it, numbered streets and avenues laid across land that was still mostly farmland and forest at the time. It was a plan for a city that didn't exist yet. Second, a stubborn governor pushed through construction of a massive canal connecting the Great Lakes all the way to the coast, a project his critics openly mocked as an expensive folly doomed to fail. When it finally opened, it slashed the cost of shipping goods from the entire American interior by an almost unbelievable margin overnight. Grain, flour, and raw materials from the heartland suddenly all flowed through this one harbor. Banks sprang up just to finance the boom. Money multiplied on itself. And the population didn't just grow steadily. It quadrupled within a single generation, swelled by enormous waves of Irish immigrants fleeing famine, Germans fleeing failed uprisings back home, and free Black Americans moving north in search of something better. Not all of that growth was pretty to look at. A notorious slum grew up on a filled-in swamp near the heart of the city, so grim and overcrowded that a famous visiting novelist described its streets in a tone of pure horror. Poverty curdled into open gang warfare, with pitched multi-day street battles that eventually required the state militia to march in and restore order. By the middle of the century, this had become the largest city anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, yet its wealth was quietly tangled up with cotton grown by enslaved labor far to the south, a connection most residents preferred not to examine too closely. That connection nearly tore the city apart. As the Civil War loomed, the sitting mayor actually proposed the city secede entirely and become an independent free port so it could keep trading with whichever side won. The city council approved the idea and had it printed and distributed. Then war actually broke out, and overnight that plan went from clever business strategy to outright treason, so everyone involved quietly pretended it had never happened. 2 years later, an unfair new draft law that let wealthy men buy their way out of military service for a fee sparked the worst riot in American history. Mobs burned buildings across entire neighborhoods for days. In one of the darkest moments imaginable, a mob set fire to an orphanage housing hundreds of Black children who barely escaped before the building collapsed. It ultimately took battle-hardened federal troops, pulled directly from the recent fighting at Gettysburg, to finally restore order in the streets. The war ended, and true to its pattern, the city emerged from it richer than when it entered. The following decades brought staggering wealth alongside staggering corruption. A political boss who controlled nearly every city contract siphoned off a fortune worth well over $1 billion in today's money, before a newspaper cartoonist helped expose and topple him. At the very same time, a genuinely awe-inspiring feat of engineering rose across the East River, a suspension bridge whose chief designer died before construction even properly began, whose son was left permanently disabled from the construction process itself, and whose son's wife ended up personally overseeing the final years of the project, becoming the very first person